Hi, and welcome to the Good Fight on Blogging Heads TV, where we bring together people who disagree on a topic to explore their differences and try to find some common ground. I'm Aryeh Cohen-Wade. I'm the managing editor of Blogging Heads, and I'll be the heard but not seen moderator today. My guests today are Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic, and Edward Lucas, a senior editor at The Economist, and the author of the new ebook, The Snowden Operation Inside the West's Greatest Intelligence Disaster. So my first question would be, did Edward Snowden do the right thing, or should he serve jail time in America?
Well, I think he did the wrong thing and he should serve jail time. I'm not against whistleblowers in principle, and I think it would be possible to construct a case for being a whistleblower based on some of the material that he stole and published. But what he did goes way beyond his purported concern of the turnkey totalitarianism that he thought the NSA was preparing. He stole a colossal number of documents and has leaked them in a very damaging way, and in a way that arises grave suspicion. So I'm afraid that he does have to face justice and face music.
I take mostly the opposite position. I know we're going to disagree about some of these claims as the conversation goes on, but I'll just kind of state my views as they are. Basically, I think that the case that Edward Snowden's leaks gave us a lot of very important information about American democracy and about the surveillance state is very strong. The case that what he revealed has great benefits is very strong. Now, if you look at the costs of these revelations, to me, that question is still kind of up in the air because we don't know all of the documents that he took, and we don't know whether they're going to get into the hands of foreign governments. We don't know if they were to get in the hands of foreign governments, what consequences that would have. So there's a lot of question marks there. I personally would be in favor of granting Edward Snowden clemency contingent upon his story holding together. And that is that he was motivated to do this as a whistleblower, not paid by some foreign government. And Edward Snowden has also claimed that he did not take these documents, does not have these documents with him in Russia, that he took adequate precautions to secure them. And so if he's being honest about those things, I would be for granting clemency. I agree that it's possible that we find out that either one of those things aren't true, but I would withdraw the clemency in that case.
I think that there's no doubt that he's sparked a debate in America. I think one can argue whether he's stimulated a good debate or perhaps skewed a debate by what he's done. But I think that you can certainly argue that the American people need to discuss the question of metadata and the way in which aggregated, warehoused metadata searched with powerful algorithms and stored on enormous computers can intrude on people's privacy in a way that wasn't really considered in the days when metadata was just the details of a telephone number that was dialed and the length of the call and so forth. So I think that's true. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that America, by international standards, already has the toughest system of intelligence oversight of any country in the world. You have two congressional committees, Senate and House. You have the FISA court, which has some delegated powers from the Supreme Court. This has been up for election in numerous congressional and presidential elections, and presidents of both stripes and House of Congress of both affiliations have gone along with this. I'm not arguing that the NSA is perfect or the system works brilliantly, but I think that for a whistleblower, the first test a whistleblower has to meet is, have you exposed really grave systematic wrongdoing of a kind that couldn't be remedied any other way? And I think that, for me, Snowden falls down at that very first hurdle.
I think that he has exposed systematic law breaking. You go and look at, we don't have every single internal audit. We don't have access to every single internal audit that the NSA has done. We do have access to a couple of them, though. And Barton Gellman, for example, in the Washington Post wrote about one single audit that revealed thousands of violations each year, that revealed a FISA court judge finding that this violated the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. And so when you're violating statutes thousands of times per year and the supreme law of the land as well, I don't know what other threshold you would want to meet for breaking the law. It seems very straightforward that's the case, that what they were doing in the absence of adequate oversight was breaking the law and was violating the rights of Americans. And again, this is the finding of a secretive court that doesn't even have someone arguing against the government. A court that I would argue is itself inadequate to do the kind of oversight it's being asked to do, the same way that I would argue that the Senate and House Intelligence Committees are also inadequate. You make a fair point that the United States does have some oversight bodies and some checks and balances that other countries do not have. At the same time, the United States has an intelligence apparatus that is far more powerful than these other countries as well.
But I think that's just not true. I mean, I think the NSA's powers are dwarfed by those of the Chinese or Russian intelligence services.
I was talking about European intelligence services, not the Russians or the Chinese. I would agree that we have better oversight than the Chinese or the Russians, and I would just say that's I want to clear a much higher.
You also, I would say, have better oversight than the Europeans, and there's no legislature anywhere in the European Union has an intelligence and security committee with anything like the sort of powers that you have in your Senate Intelligence or House Intelligence Committee have. And I think it's quite a big statement to say that this is just all totally inadequate. The fact is, the electoral process operates, and if the American people really wanted to have the NSA abolished, they're free to vote for candidates who would advocate and implement that, and it doesn't happen. So I think the idea that they don't like is an opinion that Mr. Snowden's entitled to have, but I'm not sure that it's the view of the American people. There's certainly no evidence that people wanted this change in the past. And I think more importantly, you're talking about law breaking, and the first thing to ask is, has the NSA systematically and deliberately intruded on the privacy of individual Americans? Is this something of the kind that the FBI was doing in the Continental Pro program and the abuses of the J. Edgar Hoover era? And that's simply not happening. And in all the documents that Snowden has stolen, which are no doubt cherry-picked for impact and released out of context, he hasn't been able to find a single example of the NSA deliberately intruding on the personal conversations and in emails of Americans. He's found plenty of accidental intrusions, all of which are logged by the NSA and which have, I agree, have brought stinging slapdowns from the FISA court. They're proportionately tiny in relation to the number of communications that are being looked at. But I don't think the only real scandal that he's unearthed has been the Lovett scandal, where individual NSA officials, not as part of their job, were abusing their powers to snoop on their romantic interests. And I think that's shocking. And I think in my country, I think you would be prosecuted for that, not just disciplined. And I wish that was the case in America too. So that's individual NSA officials misbehaving, rather as you have individual police officers or individual FBI special agents or individuals in any branch of government may abuse their powers. But for the whistleblower really to have a case, you've got to say that the whole agency is not just breaking the law, but doing it deliberately and in a way that can't be remedied any other way. And I still don't think you've really proved that.
Okay, well, there's lots to unpack there, but let me try and respond to a bunch of points that you made. One, I would say that the NSA is certainly a surveillance agency where at least a subset of its employees are willing to go beyond what the law allows. We know this not because of Edward Snowden's documents, but because of the Bush administration's warrantless wiretapping that was happening in the early days after 9/11, and that the NSA was fully complicit in. We learned about that because people were leaking classified information, not because the intelligence agencies put a stop to it on their own. And the people that were doing that warrantless wiretapping are still the people who, for the most part, are running the National Security Agency. So I think it's naive to think that there's an internal culture there that is insistent upon following the letter of the law. Now, when it comes to the Snowden leaks, you mentioned that the American people have shown no signs of changing this by the vote. And I would just say this is the opportunity that the Snowden leaks have given them, and it has changed the political dynamic in the United States substantially. I don't know how the American people would have known to vote out this system that they didn't like if they weren't even aware of bulk metadata collection, if they weren't even aware of many of the other things that the NSA is doing. And this is a point that I think is essential to this whole conversation that, the American House of Representatives, for example, was designed to reflect the passions of the people as they evolve on issues, right? It's supposed to be the branch of government that is closest to the people. I'm supposed to be able to go relatively close to my house and find a congressional office and be able to write a letter, to go to a town hall meeting, to lobby these people. And in the case of the NSA, not only would I not have known to voice my concerns to my representatives, but in many cases, the representatives themselves were uninformed about what was going on. The people on the House Intelligence Committee, for example, knew about bulk metadata collection and knew about the way that the Patriot Act was being reinterpreted. And that's another problem, the way that the Patriot Act was being reinterpreted. I would argue what they're doing goes beyond the wording of the statute. But
well, I think
the House members who were elected in the 2010 election and who were asked to vote on the reauthorization of the Patriot Act in early 2011, the head of the House Intelligence Committee didn't even brief them. They weren't even aware of what was going on. The elected legislature wasn't aware. And to me, that is a huge problem in a democracy. And it goes directly against the system that the framers were intending, to have members of Congress voting on something where they weren't even aware of its implications.
I think you've hugely undermined your own case, if I may say so, with your point about the warrantless wiretapping. And the fact that you say that we already knew this stuff. Well, we already knew this stuff before Mr. Snowden even decided to go and steal his documents. Now,
we knew about different abuses.
We knew about different abuses, but you were saying if it wasn't for Snowden, we wouldn't know about this. But actually, we know about this because of leaks which happened before Snowden, which I would argue were much more justifiable. I think you can make a strong case for saying that the American administrations after 9/11 overreacted on some things, and it wouldn't just be on warrantless wiretapping, but I would argue the whole preposterous security theatre at airports and many other things besides were overreactions. And I think that the leaks that exposed the warrantless wiretapping were far more justifiable. And in my book, I argue very strongly that whistleblowers on national security issues should be protected and not persecuted when they expose something that's genuinely going wrong. But I don't think that the Snowden hasn't really exposed anything on the scale of warrantless wiretapping. He's shown that we have the warehousing of metadata, and I agree that's important. And I think if he'd simply exposed the Verizon court order and maybe some of the toing and froing on the Pfizer court between the court and the NSA on the question of metadata, I think you could make an argument. I think I probably wouldn't support it myself, but you could make an argument that that was a justified whistleblowing. But that very small benefit, to my mind, is outweighed by the colossal damage, which I think that the Snowdenistas, as I call them, his fan club, simply don't acknowledge. They don't ever respond to the question: why is it in the public interest to expose how democracies spy on dictatorships? Why is it in the public interest to expose what Sweden and Norway do with the United States to protect themselves against Russia? Why is it in the public interest to give away the sources and methods of intelligence? Why did Mr. Snowden show with the South China Morning Post the IP addresses and other techniques that the NSA uses to intercept SMS messages and emails inside China? We should be spying on China. It's a communist dictatorship. And I find this whole this kind of blithe, oblivious attitude of the Snowdenistas to all the damage that's done is extraordinary. No one's asking, why did Snowden feel it necessary to go beyond his purported concern over Americans' privacy and just cause this colossal damage and all sorts of other things that most Americans, I think most people in the West, would regard as entirely legitimate?
Conor, would you agree that some of Snowden's revelations have done damage to the United States?
It depends on how you define damage. I mean, certainly it's caused diplomatic embarrassment. And if you look at, for example, the revelation that we were spying on Angela Merkel's cell phone, right? This caused diplomatic embarrassment with an ally. And am I particularly troubled by spying on Angela Merkel's cell phone? Me personally, I'm the least concerned about spying on foreign heads of state. I think that basically, certainly that's within the laws that the NSA is subject to, and I think that there's also a case to be made that foreign heads of state spying on one another has an overall good effect in the world. In other words, we want to know that the Russians aren't going to invade, and we want the Russians to know that we're not going to invade. And there's a sense in which intelligence gathering reassures the world that there's nothing hidden and secret going on and reduces paranoia, right? So do I think there's any great harm caused by listening into Angela Merkel's cell phone? No. Would I personally have leaked that if I were an NSA staffer who was going to give up my career? No, I don't think I would have leaked that particular thing.
But I mean, so Conor, you're focusing on stuff that's trivial and spectacular. You haven't dealt with my main point, which is why is it in the public interest to expose how democracies spy on dictatorships?
Right. So I wanted to concede up front that there are these instances where I think some harm was done. But when it comes to the point about democracies spying on dictatorships, right? As I conceded at the beginning, I can imagine something coming out of the Snowden trove of documents that does damage the United States vis-a-vis Russia or China, say. I just haven't seen anything to this point where I can look at it and say, well, here is the damaging thing, and here's the damage that's been done, and this is serious damage. I can't point to that specific thing. When I see evidence for that specific thing, I will acknowledge that there's been a harm done. But it seems to me that your case for great harm is speculative, and that you were arguing before that the United States, the American people already knew about some of these NSA things, knew about the warrantless wiretapping. Well, certainly the Chinese and the Russians know that the NSA tries to spy on them, right? It's no revelation it's no revelation to Russia that European countries and that the United States are both trying to steal its secrets. It's no. I'm sorry. This is trying to steal our secrets, right? So, if you could give me a specific instance and say, here is the harm to the United States, then we can talk about it. But it seems like you're making speculative.
I can give you dozens of instances, and they're all pretty much public. But I list them in the book, and I'll just give one very recent one, which is the ability to exploit computer games, and this ridiculous game Angry Birds, which is very popular. The NSA had found a flaw in that, which allowed it to use the geolocation data, which users have generate sometimes unwittingly, and you can get in through this and other computer games. You can use it to it creates a whole, in non-technical language, it opens gaps in people's computer security, and the NSA can get in through that and do stuff. And that's not a capability that's very widely known. I was researching a book on cybersecurity before I started this, and I was given a little hint about the ability to use computer games against target countries by an official who implored me not to make any mention of this at all in my book, because it would cause grave national security damage, because many people, whether they're terrorists or in Russia or China or wherever, play Western computer games, and sometimes they play them on their work computers. And this is a major opportunity for us for our intelligence agencies to work on that. That's just one thing, but there's a whole others. There was details of how we spy on the tribesmen and the tribal authorities in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. There was the point I made earlier about the IP addresses that we use or we used to use to get into the Chinese SMS system. All the tasking orders that were leaked. This is the crown jewels of the intelligence organisations, are the instructions for what your authorities, your political authorities want you to find out. Now those haven't been published yet, but they have been taken, and this is very damaging. The stuff I mentioned before about Norway and Sweden, and I'm sure it's of great interest to the Russians to know that the Norwegians are helping the NSA with human intelligence sources inside Russia where America doesn't have them, and in return that the Russians are helping the Norwegians and the Swedes with satellite information. And this is the sort of stuff you just don't want to give away. And I can't see, and even if you argue, well, that you could probably guess some of this stuff, what's the public interest? What's it say about Snowden's motivation and the Snowdenistas' motivation that they should choose to steal this stuff in the first place and then go ahead and publish it?
Well, I mean, let's talk about the first example that you mentioned, the Angry Birds revelation, right? Do you see no public interest in the release of that information?
I think this is one of the many capabilities developed with great ingenuity, considerable expense, and many man-hours, which is it's a classic foreign intelligence technique. You find some vulnerability on the opponent's side and you work out a way of exploiting it. Maybe it's just one hop in many hops to get you to your target. But if that allows, if the fact that Russians or Chinese or Islamic terrorists or anyone else is playing Angry Birds allows us to get into their communications, I think that's entirely legitimate. And I don't see there's any public interest in revealing that. It's like revealing the launch codes for, or the acoustic signatures for a nuclear submarine. Once it's released, you can't, the submarine is then useless. It can't go to sea anymore.
Sure,
and once this is released, everybody who's got Angry Birds on their computer or on their iPad now thinks, oh gosh, the NSA could use that, and they will delete it and turn it off. And there are many, and I listen in my book, there are many, many examples of this stuff.
Right. So the difference between the nuclear submarine and releasing the acoustic signature, which I would agree would be a leak that had no public interest in Angry Birds, right, is that our enemies are not the only ones using Angry Birds. In fact, most of the people who are using Angry Birds are not our enemies. So if there's this game that is out there in the wild that I don't know, probably millions of Americans and millions of people elsewhere in the world are using, and it has a security flaw that allows foreign intelligence agents to breach it and to breach the security of that device, right? Isn't that a useful thing for me to know as a journalist, say, that I'm not going to use, if I'm interviewing, say, dissidents in China, if I'm interviewing people in a country where I don't want their government to know that I'm talking to them as a journalist, I'm not going to have Angry Birds on the phone that I use to contact these people, right? If I am an American citizen who doesn't trust the intelligence agencies to follow the law, since they've broken it before, I'm not going to have Angry Birds on my devices. This is a security gap, right, that doesn't just affect our enemies, it affects everyone with Angry Birds. And the NSA's approach in these situations is to imagine that they're the only ones who are able to exploit this, and to imagine that they are not going to abuse it, and to keep it secret. And it raises the same question as the NSA weakening encryption standards, right? They're weakening these products that are not just used by our enemies, they're doing so in a way that affects every innocent person who's using the internet and undermines the security of the internet itself, right? Now, they didn't create the Angry Birds thing in the way that they've created this this problem with encryption, where they use a fake random number generator. But when it comes to Angry Birds, there's a case to be made that the NSA ought to be out in front warning Americans when these kinds of popular products have security flaws in them that would allow the Chinese or the Russians to hack into my computer, right? So I think that it's a clear case where. So I think that there's a clear case to be made that there is some public benefit actually to the disclosure of Angry Birds, and I will grant you that there could be some loss. It could be that there is a terrorist who had Angry Birds on his phone and now he's taken it off and we don't know about that anymore, right? And so let's think carefully about this cost, right? It could be the case that that terrorist takes Angry Birds off his phone and actually never causes us any damage. It could be that we also have human intelligence assets that know about him and that he's killed in a drone strike tomorrow, right? It could be the case that he commits a terrorist attack 3 years down the line that he wouldn't have committed if not for Angry Birds. There's a lot of scenarios that could play out, but I think that you're assuming worst cases in a lot of these scenarios, as if this is the only intelligence, these things that are being revealed are the only intelligence assets that we have, and we're in for imminent attack or something because they've been revealed.
Well, I think it was well known, even before Mr. Snowden was ever heard of. There was a very serious, if rather geeky, debate about zero-day exploits, the flaws in computer software and sometimes hardware that nobody knows about. And there's discussion about whether we need to have an international convention on digital weapons and on all the export of digital weapons and what we can do on the in terms of confidence building measures. And some of this mirrors the sort of discussion we were having in the nuclear era, which I, being old and sad, remember. So I think it's not true to say that Snowden has sort of suddenly produced this debate out of nowhere. But I think these capabilities are extremely important, and so long as we have the I leave aside the question of whether the NSA was deliberately breaking cryptography, of which there's some evidence, although not conclusive. But if that was the case, then I think that's a tactical success, but a strategic failure. Particularly now as it's come out. Now, in general, I'm in favour of software being strong and regularly patched rather than being full of holes. But I think that Snowden is not in a position to judge. And how can a lowly sysadmin working for a contractor be the right person to decide whether America's most expensive and important capabilities are suddenly rendered useless? The decision about the use of 0 days is one to be made in a democracy, I would argue, by the leaders of the democracy, duly elected, working under the law, at the highest level, with all the considerations of national security in pluses and minuses involved. I just don't see the case for these random acts of sabotage, which is what Mr. Snowden has committed, in my view. And I just want to get back to this the point about what does this say about his motivation? What is it that he hates so much about the NSA and about America and about the West, he and his supporters, that they think it's a good idea to give away secrets about how we spy on dictatorships? And I think that actually reveals what I describe as a sort of rather nihilistic anti-Western, hacktivist, anarchist sort of approach, which ascribes no moral weight to the West at all, and thinks that our governments are the enemy, and is utterly oblivious to the far greater human rights abuses and other problems in our rivals and competitors, namely Russia and China. So I think that this is the sort of the fundamental philosophical flaw of the Snowdenistas. They just don't think that although they may have their differences with America and the West, they're actually these countries are actually pretty well run by international standards, and by weakening them, you don't improve the general level of human rights and legality around the world.
Conor, how would you respond to the fact that Snowden went to two authoritarian countries to escape American justice?
And explicitly praises them. He praised Venezuela, he praised Cuba, he praised Ecuador, he praised Russia in one of his very rare public statements since arriving in Moscow.
So a few things. I want to respond to all of these things. One, he praised Russia, China. I didn't hear Venezuela, but in those two cases, he praised a very particular thing about them. He didn't praise Russian society or Chinese society in general. He praised them for allowing him to be there, essentially, and for protecting him. So I don't think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that Edward Snowden has praised the human rights record of China or Russia. I don't think that he's praised the system of laws in their society. Hold on, I'm trying to shut off this cell phone. You criticized Snowden and other what you call Snowdenistas in your book for failing to leak things about China and Russia, for failing to criticize China and Russia, who have surveillance states that are far more odious than the United States. I would just say, as someone who writes about human rights and surveillance issues, I certainly direct a disproportionate amount of my fire at the United States, despite it having what I acknowledge to be a much better record than foreign countries, because I expect more of the United States. I could spend all of my time writing about the horrors of North Korea, perhaps the worst nation state on this earth, the nation state with the most corrupt leadership, where the most horrific things happen. But my proposition going into being a journalist and a citizen is that the sort of criticism that I'm writing of the United States is strengthening free society, not weakening it, and that the very fact that we have the ability to criticize and a responsibility to criticize things that our government does that transgress against the law or against morals strengthens our society, does not weaken it.
Well, that's a very strong point, and I'm all in favour of criticising governments, and I do it a great deal myself. But I think there's a huge difference between criticising within the system and this kind of incredibly destructive leaking. What was the justification for taking 1.7 million documents, or even if it was 50,000? he could have made his case with 5.
I would like to know more about how many documents he actually took and what his reasons were for seizing that. Whether it was that he,
I couldn't agree more. And isn't it odd that we can't ask him?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I missed that little part. You said, "Wouldn't it? Isn't it?"
I said I couldn't agree more. And isn't it strange that he's in a place where we can't ask him?
I would like to put this question to him: why did you steal? Why did you steal all of these documents? Why not a much narrower trove? Right.
And Conor, as a very experienced journalist, don't you find it odd that he's now in a place where you can't ask him these rather obvious questions, and that he doesn't feel any obligation to put himself in a position where he might be able to answer them?
I actually don't. You look at him going to China and Russia as suspicious as he's going to these enemies that try to recruit Western intelligence assets, and you suspect that he's been recruited or paid by the Russians, perhaps. I can understand why him going to Russia makes you think that, and I'm certainly open to the possibility that it turns out that that's the case. And again, I wouldn't, I would hinge any offer of clemency on that not being the case. At the same time, it seems to me that the explanation that's been offered, essentially that he didn't want to go to prison and he needed to go to a country that wasn't going to extradite him to the United States, it seems straightforward enough, right? That seems like a plausible, at least, explanation of why he would go to Russia or China.
Well, it seems to me it's a very, very odd explanation. If you want to be a whistleblower and you want to be vindicated as a whistleblower and you want to take the moral high ground, then you would take care not to do things that would make it hard for people to defend you. And I think the longer he stays in Russia, where he arrived so strangely in circumstances that really haven't been explained, including spending his birthday at the Russian consulate in Hong Kong, apparently, at least according to Mr. Putin.
He denies that.
Yes, I think there's a certain ambiguity. This was in the Russian papers and then mentioned by Mr. Putin. And I'm not sure whether he denies he's been to the Russian consulate or whether he just denied he spent his birthday there. But in any case, it's very strange the way he went to Russia. Why did he? What was he doing in those 2 weeks before from disappearing from Hawaii and turning up in Hong Kong? Why did he think Hong Kong was a good place to go? That's not going to boost your credibility as a whistleblower to turn up in a was effectively part of a communist dictatorship. Why was his escape plan so strange? And then chiefly, why is it so hard to get hold of him? If you were really a whistleblower and your conscience was completely clear and you have freedom of action, wouldn't you be giving daily Skype press conferences to all and sundry, explaining exactly what you did and why you did it? Instead of which, he's sitting in as far as we can work out, some kind of Russian government guest house, guarded in the loving arms of the FSB, who provided him with a lawyer to mediate his conversation with the public, and nobody from outside is even you as a sympathetic journalist who say you're longing to ask him questions. You think he's got a lot of questions he ought to answer, and he won't even talk to you.
A few things. First, Snowden
isn't that rather suspicious?
Snowden has given interviews to a number of journalists, right? He gave an interview to Barton Gellman, one of the people that he leaked the documents to, who went to Russia and visited.
Wonderful. He talks to one of his key allies, one of his greatest allies, and to a very sympathetic German politician. I don't call that exposing yourself to public scrutiny.
He's given a number of other interviews, right? He did a live chat style interview where he answered one of Jake Tapper's questions, actually. That was just recently online. He gave an interview to Jane Mayer of the New Yorker. He's given an interviews to a bunch of foreign newspapers that coincided with releases in those countries. I think he gave one to one of the big newspapers in Brazil, the name of which escapes me, for example. This other question, I mean, it seems like he was always going to be in this pickle, right, where all of the countries that he might flee to that wouldn't cast any suspicion on him were also going to be friendly to the United States and willing to turn him over to American authorities. Again, perhaps his case would have been stronger as a whistleblower if he wouldn't have wound up in Russia. Perhaps fewer people would be suspicious of his motivations, and that would strengthen the overall case. I don't know. But it also seems to me that one of the reasons that he has not been giving daily Skype interviews is because he understands that he's a very polarizing figure, and he wants the focus to be on what he has revealed rather than his personal character or motivations. He wants us talking about the National Security Agency and the movement to reform it, and he understands that insofar as he's the face of that, he's a very polarizing face. Much better that the ACLU, right, or better yet, Senator Ron Wyden or something is the face of it, not Edward Snowden, who some people like yourself think is perhaps a foreign spy. I think he's not unaware of.
Yes, I mean, just to be clear, I'm not saying that he's a conscious Russian agent. My hypothesis, and it is only a hypothesis, is that they could have recruited him under a false flag, where he would think he was doing the cause of freedom and justice a service, but actually that it was at least to some extent manipulated along the way by the Russian intelligence service, which is a skill they've shown they're very good at. But I think this idea that whenever people say, "Oh no, it's not about me, it's about the story," it's usually because they've got something to hide. And if you make yourself into a public figure, which he has done, you should be willing to answer questions and give interviews and try and dispel suspicions. And he's stoking suspicions. But I also think that we're still not approaching this in the frame of mind that one should really use when dealing with something of this gravity, which is to say, what are the costs and what are the benefits, and what do the balance of costs and benefits tell us about this whole story? And everyone is jumping, to my mind, with enormous naivete and hypocrisy on the revelations that spy agencies spy. What did we think they were doing? We think they were playing Sudoku all the time.
And yet it's
on the revelation that they have incredible capabilities. Well, what did we think they were going to do with all that money? And the idea that the metadata collection in America is legally quite tricky and is very hard to do in accordance with the rules, and is a major headache. And I think that's true. We knew that before. We know it even more now. But I weigh all that up against the damage, which I keep coming back to. And why are people so extraordinarily paranoid about their own countries and so amazingly trusting about their enemies?
Edward, if I could just jump in and move us to a slightly different topic. Doesn't the fact that this leak was technologically possible, I mean, we've talked a lot about Snowden and his motivations, but isn't a Snowden-like figure inevitable when you have these massive secret bureaucracies and the way that technology is changing? We saw the WikiLeaks that came from an army private. How do you respond to this idea that something like this was bound to happen eventually?
Well, I think an excellent piece of journalism by the Washington Post a couple of years ago, which was done without the basis of really destructive and illegal whistleblowing, but just on the basis of very, very thorough and good reporting, showed that America has far too many people with top secret security clearances, and the intelligence bureaucracy is absolutely enormous and often different agencies getting in each other's way. That the use of private contractors has ballooned to absurd proportions, and it's all in serious need of reform. And I endorse that completely. And I think that one of the big lessons of the whole Snowden affair is that the NSA and the CIA and others need to review, particularly the NSA, I would argue, need to review their use of private contractors, the so-called contractorization. But I think that the argument that because Snowden was able to steal the secrets, therefore it's all right, is facile. Just because someone gets into your house and steals your stuff doesn't then mean it's all right for him to go and sell it or misuse it. A crime is a crime. And I think that Snowden, it's also interesting to note that, at least according to the NSA, and I know Snowden denies this, he was able to steal this stuff by getting the logins and passwords of colleagues. Which is, again, not exactly the behaviour of a whistleblower, but would be the behaviour of someone who'd perhaps been groomed and motivated by a foreign intelligence service, however unwittingly.
So, since we're trying to see consensus here on the good fight, you would concede that too many people have top secret clearances, and the American security state is too big for what it's trying to do right now.
I think that it's too big. It's in many ways it's bureaucratic and ineffective, and I think it's lost sight of the essential kind of mischief which is at the heart of good, intelligence, and it's very hard to run intelligence as a sort of rules-based bureaucracy. Obviously, you need some rules. I actually personally think that the American system of oversight is too onerous and rather dangerously brings politicians too close to the intelligence world, which may mean they're inclined to meddle or perhaps even worse, to leak. So I think there's a big
Connor,
reform agenda.
a question
But
from
every
you.
bit of that.
Hang
on a minute. But I just want to say, just 1 minute, just one. I just want to say, every bit of that agenda, everything that we need to change, we knew about before Snowden. What he's done is just cause colossal and unnecessary damage.
Okay, Connor, a question from you for you. What should the government be keeping secret? What came out? I mean, you mentioned the Angela Merkel cell phone.
Uh-huh.
What is there anything else that troubled you from what has been released by Snowden, or where would you draw the line in what the government does that the public doesn't know about?
Oh, certainly. I think things like nuclear codes, the location of our nuclear arsenal, the identities and locations of CIA agents abroad, military plans for the war in Afghanistan, if we were sending troops to some area, some troop movements, things like that. I certainly think that all of those are legitimate secrets and that they should be punished if they are revealed. And one other point of agreement that I want to highlight, for all of our differences, we do have this. We do see the principle at issue the same in a way, where we agree that the focus should be on judging a leak by its costs and its benefits, and I think that once you're in that framework, we disagree about the costs of this leak, I think, and one thing that we haven't really talked about is why I think that these leaks have great benefit. It isn't just that they have revealed lawbreaking. It isn't just that 3 branches of government now have stepped in with different ideas for how to reform the system since these leaks occurred. I think that one of the things, and I'd love to get your take on this, is when I look at metadata collection, and when I look at the collection of internet browsing behavior as well on millions of Americans, and this information being stored for a period of at least 5 years, to me, I look at this and I think, wow, it would be very easy for someone to abuse this trove of data on millions of innocent Americans in the future, for purposes of blackmail, for purposes of manipulating the political system. It seems to me that it would be very easy to, for example, if there were to be a politician who were to be rising in the United States and who posed an institutional threat to the NSA because this person was going to be elected senator or perhaps going to win the nomination of one of the parties for president, how easy would it be to go into this big trove of information about millions of Americans? And we know, because they don't know exactly what Edward Snowden took, that at least some people can do this within the NSA without being audited, right? And how easy would it be to discredit someone in a way that wasn't really traceable, to get information about someone and to pretend as if you were an opposition researcher and leak it to Politico or something, right? And to destroy someone's career in this way. Now, this presumes, obviously, that someone within the NSA would be willing to break the law. And so why would I think this about my own country, that someone would be willing to do this? And I would just say, when I look at these surveillance issues and the need for oversight, I look not only at the long history that the NSA and the FBI have of different abuses at different periods in American history, not only at the Nixon administration and its willingness to steal secrets, right? I also look at my country after 9/11. There were people in the government who were willing to torture other human beings, even though it was clearly illegal. There are people within the NSA who are willing to do this warrantless wiretapping, even though it was clearly illegal. And so, to me, it's naive to think that you can have this trove of personal information on millions of people and that it's never going to be abused. It seems obvious to me that it is going to be abused at some point if we don't have any better oversight than what we have right now. And that it's foolish to keep it, not only because someone in the United States could abuse it, but imagine a foreign government getting access to this trove of information, and we have no reason to think that the NSA is particularly good at guarding their secrets. Imagine the Russians installing someone in the NSA who had access to these secrets. And again, this is something they've succeeded in doing before, placing someone high. So I don't understand why you're not more alarmed by having this trove of data that could be abused, given past abuses, and that they've sprung up at so many points in American history.
Well, first of all, I think you have to be careful about going back and saying that because the government did something bad in the past, it's going to do something bad in the future. I think there's we tend to have new abuses as well as old ones, and I'm slightly worried about the sort of reflex references to the abuses of the 60s and 70s. I hope that we have learnt something since then, and we do have a better oversight than we did. The Church Commission made some reforms which have stuck, and the FISA court, I think, although you probably want it to be tougher, it does offer some oversight. Secondly, it is just worth noting that any American intelligence officer who did that would face not just the sack, but also criminal prosecution. But I think, and I said at the beginning, I do worry about metadata generally, and it's not just the NSA's trove of metadata, but it's all the metadata that companies such as Google and Facebook have as well. And I think we need to think quite hard about how what we do about all the vast amounts of metadata that we leave everywhere we go. I mean, even if the NSA wasn't collecting it, you'd still be able to get very large amounts from all sorts of other. We leave a kind of like snails. We leave a sort of trail of data and metadata behind us. And I think we are going to have to rethink our attitudes to privacy and security and what we do on the internet. Not just because the NSA has the ability to warehouse this data and under some circumstances with a warrant to search it, and then under some other circumstances potentially to do something on that. And I don't, but I think that's a bigger discussion. But I would just point out that you take for granted that the NSA is a habitual lawbreaker. What I see from those slides is an agency which is quite tied up in knots about obeying the letter of the law. Now, they may not get it right all the time, but there's nothing there's not a single slide about this is how you get round these tasks and legal restrictions. There's quite a lot of stuff about watch out when you're doing this, that you don't, let me just finish. I mean, if you look, I mean, there's one case where they said, supposing we wanted to use our techniques to investigate a restaurant where some, I think it was some smugglers were meeting. Well, we'd have to watch out on that because it could be seen to be like something that was done in the 70s, whose name now escapes me, Impressed or something, which was bad. The only case where in all this cherry-picked material, the only case where personal data was even considered to be used was in the case of 6 jihadi propagandists who all had extensive habits using underage sex and child porn on the net. And one of the slides shows the NSA was thinking, if we were to leak this stuff, it might discredit them in the eyes of their followers who believe that they're very pious Muslims. Note, not shall we do it, and this would be, and it was considered as a possibility. Of those 6, 5 were non-Americans. Now, I think there's a lot to be said against the NSA or any other agency practicing sort of dedicated information warfare based on these sort of smears, because it has a bad history. But if that's the worst, I think many Americans would think, why not? And if that's the worst example of abuse of personal privacy, of direct abuse of personal privacy, that of a named individual that the Snowdenistas can come up with, that to me doesn't depict an agency that's out of control.
2 points. One, I'm astonished by the claim that you don't think that the Snowden revelations have shown an agency that tries to get around the law. It seems to me that, for example, they had a arguably lawful way to ask for information from Google and Yahoo, right, through this process within the United States that at least went through the FISA court. But they didn't want to use that all the time, and so they tapped the overseas cables of Google so that they could just hoover up information.
It's completely legal. It's completely legal. It's completely legal.
Of collecting information on Americans, they just went overseas where it's completely legal in order to get around it, and just took the information directly from the internet cables, right? They're not allowed to look at the information of Americans, the metadata of Americans, without these FISA court orders. And so what they did, first of all, is to ignore the need for particularity and to just get orders to hear all phone calls, right? I'm sorry, to look at the metadata of all phone calls. And then they have these querying rules where they're only allowed to query certain numbers that seem like they're related to terrorism. And they've gotten beyond that by not only going 3 hops out from these numbers, but once they go 3 hops out, regardless of whether it's an important investigation or whether it's a fleeting thing and they determine, oh, this wasn't something to worry about, they put all of that information in the corporate store indefinitely where they can search it forever. So, I mean, of course they are going around and coming up with solutions to get around every kind of way that would prevent them from getting more information. This is what they do. They want as much information as possible for as long as they can have it, because they don't know what they're going to want to look through in the future. And the one other point that you mentioned earlier, and that you also mentioned in your book that I want to respond to real quick, you look at the audits and the thousands of violations that I keep mentioning, and your response to that is that, oh, well, this is a very small percentage of all of the searches that they do, right? And so perhaps they have 3,000 instances of a violation, but this is in the context of, say, 30 million searches. And trillion, billions, sure.
Billions.
And the reason that I don't think that is a very strong argument, imagine something we would both agree would be a terrible abuse. For example, there's the famous case of trying to blackmail Martin Luther King, one of the worst intelligence abuses in American history. So imagine a figure like that today, and imagine that the NSA queried him, right? That's one violation, right? And now imagine that they run 1 million automated searches on legitimate terrorist targets, where they just query them over and over and over again by computers for a month, and the number is astronomical, right? It's just 1 in a million that there was an abuse, right?
But you're comparing apples and oranges here.
And then I'll let you respond. We also have this instance of the NSA analyst accidentally putting in the area code for Washington, D.C. instead of the country code of Egypt, and sweeping up all the communications for the 202 area code, the Washington, D.C. area code, for some unknown period of time, right? Now, if one violation can sweep up a whole city's metadata, and then, again, the NSA has powerful computers that allow it to run all kinds of legitimate queries over and over and over and over again. Again, you come up with an instance where that only 1 in a million or even 1 in a billion, that one is much more important than it would seem from saying, oh, well, this is a very small percentage. The percentage is inconsequential because you can always juke the statistics, as they would say in The Wire. You can always make it seem as if your percentage is great by just running all kinds of queries that are okay to obscure the one query that wasn't okay, that is actually very consequential. I mean, what possible, in this setup, what possible relevance does the percentage have?
Well, I think first of all, I think you're slightly comparing apples and oranges, because this would be like saying if a cop just shoots an innocent person 1 day a year, then he's only committing violations 0.3% of the time, and that would clearly be absurd. But I think that you've got to start from the basis of what are they actually trying to do, and they're monitoring communications dialed from abroad, and they have they're trying to see how we know terrorists are trying to communicate with people inside the United States, and I think that's an entirely legitimate thing for the NSA. They're not collecting metadata for fun because they like writing down numbers. They're doing it because they're worried about threats which they think metadata can help illuminate. And inevitably, there is going to be a chance of what they call a US person, meaning either a permanent resident or citizen, being caught up in that. And if it's a greater than 50% chance, then they have to stop. Then they have to stop doing it, because that would need that would need a warrant. So I think many Americans, I think, would think that's a broadly. Do we need to have the ability to look at this stuff? Yes. Is it going to be tricky? Yes. Are we going to need some safeguards? Yes. Is it going to go right or be right every single time? No. What do you do with when you get it wrong? Well, you report it, and if it's turns out you've actually typed some wrong thing into your computer and you've confused Egypt with Washington DC, well then put something in so that doesn't happen again. But I don't think that it's on the same sort of dramatic scale, or even remotely comparable, to trying to blackmail a civil rights leader into committing suicide. And I think that you need to, again, I mean, I keep on coming back to this. Why are we being so paranoid about the NSA and so trusting about Russia? I think the NSA is actually under constant, intense scrutiny. I mean, not just from journalists like you, but it has, lawmakers like Senator Wyden who are poking around. You've got a large and vocal sort of NGO community that worries about it, former whistleblowers. The NSA doesn't operate in a kind of complete legal vacuum where it can get away with whatever it wants. And also, the other thing I just point out is that the NSA is also employees are also American citizens. They didn't sign up for this because they have this sort of pathological desire to spy on people. They sign up because they want to defend their country. And I think there's a certain sort of demonization going on where it's almost as if people think that the Bourne Identity is a documentary.
It's not that we think the Bourne Identity is a documentary. And I agree that the most NSA employees signed up because they wanted to protect their country. They had the best of motives, right? The people who signed up for the FBI during the Hoover years mostly signed up because they wanted to protect their country. The people who tortured people in the Bush administration did it because they wanted to protect their country. The idea that the good-heartedness of the American people can be relied on to prevent abuses goes against everything we know of history and the whole logic of having checks and balances in our system.
I'm not saying checks and balances are bad. I'm just saying that the idea that when you look, I mean, does anyone really think that Keith Alexander is the reincarnation of J. Edgar Hoover? I think it seems to be that there was a particular paranoid mindset during the Cold War, which we saw both during the McCarthy era and with the Hoover era in the FBI. And I don't think that we're living in that now.
I don't think it's exactly the same now as it was during the Cold War. I think there's certainly a paranoia to the war on terrorism, and I think that we have seen terrible abuses in the war on terrorism that are documented and that almost everyone would acknowledge. Again, the torture of human beings, right?
They were documented and acknowledged without. We didn't need Edward Snowden.
We certainly needed other whistleblowers. We needed other whistleblowers to tell us what was happening. Yeah. And they were breaking the law in some cases to reveal this. They were revealing classified information.
Well, if you want to end on a note of consensus, I have said in the book, and I'm saying here, that I think whistleblowing can be absolutely the right thing to do, and that democracies, even democracies, and certainly not perfect, abuses do happen, and sometimes blowing a whistle is the best way to bring an end to it. But you've always got to ask, is the pattern of abuse identified really gross and systematic and not open to any other kind of remedy? Has the whistleblower tried to think about public safety and the wider consequences of what he does? And has the material he's stolen been limited to that which supports his case? And I would finish by saying I think Edward Snowden fails on all three of those counts.
And I would pledge going forward to keep a close eye on any damage that is caused by the Snowden leaks, and insofar as I can nail any down, to write about that damage and to make it part of the public back and forth about.
Well, can I ask you to do one other thing? Is to apply your best journalistic most suspicious instincts to Snowden, all the same suspicion you apply to the NSA. Write down 10 really good questions that you think would illuminate that, and then see if you can get him to answer them. And if you can't, ask yourself why not.
Sure. Yeah, I can think of what I would ask Snowden that hasn't already been asked and answered. And I would conclude by saying that I would hope that you would watch the NSA debate as it unfolds and think of the worst case scenarios that could have been prevented by the extra scrutiny and oversight and hopefully, in my mind, changes in laws that occur. And I would argue that if it turns out to be the case that Congress changes the law substantially, or that the Supreme Court rules that the metadata collection actually violates the Fourth Amendment, or that a public advocate is put in front of the FISA court to argue the other side from the government, then that would be a significant benefit that came from the Snowden revelations, and it probably won't change your notions of the costs, but it will certainly be an important benefit when the people did decide, after having full information, that we ought to govern ourselves in a different way.
Well, I think that might be a good point to end. We had some common ground, and I would also, if Edward Snowden is out there listening to this, we'd be happy to host
Yes.
any conversation you wish to have on the Blogging Heads platform. But we did, I think there was some areas of agreement, not many, but I think we elucidated the disagreements pretty well.